Good morning, delegates, doctors. This is Shivani, your hall coordinator, and I welcome you to 79th All India Ophthalmological Conference 2021. We'll start with our session, and here I invite our chairman, Dr. Usha R., our moderator for the day, Dr. Parikshit Gogate, Dr. Feroz, um, sorry, ma'am. If I'm
Doesn't matter.
pronouncing
You
it
can just
wrong.
skip the
Yeah.
second name. Thank you.
For the panelists, we have Dr. Somen Mishra, Dr. Ashok Kumar Grover, Dr. Santosh G. Honavar, Dr. Mukesh Sharma, Dr. Neelam Pushkar, Dr. Mohammad Javed Ali, Dr. Chinmay Trishula Murthy, and Dr. Akshay Nair. Over to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shivani. So once again, good morning and greetings to respected Chair, Dr. Usha, Co-Chair, Dr. Bhavna Sharma, expert panelists, speakers, and our dear delegates. So on behalf of All India Ophthalmological Society and Scientific Committee, we, Dr. Parikshit Gogte and me, Fairuz, invite you all to this need of the hour session on mucormycosis. We all know that recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen and witnessed a massive surge of a rare fungal disease, mucormycosis. And we as specialists, including oculoplastic surgeons, ENT surgeons, neurosurgeons, intensivists, microbiologists, and radiologists all came together at this point of time promptly to tackle this disease. So today we have various speakers, eminent speakers from different part of India and in various fields who will be sharing their experience with us. So may I invite our first speaker, Dr. Parvez Ahmed Siddiqui, Professor of Government Medical College, Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh, to share the data of Central India. I hope he's there in the Dr. Parvez. Dr. Parikshit? Dr. Parikshit, are you there?
Dr. Parikshit, I would request if you can unmute the mic, please.
And Dr. Parvez is still not joined. So we will go to the next speaker is Dr. Rajendra Prasad Maurya. Akshay Nair?
I like Akshay Kumar also.
Akshay Nair, do you want to take over? I think he has told you to take it.
I will. I think I mean, he couldn't attend it because he was actually having mucormycosis.
Hello, ma'am.
Has asked me to present his presentation, and I think it's important. Even though this is not my data. It's extremely important that the data that he has and his experience should be known to our attendees, given the wide variety of cases and the number of cases that they have seen across the entire spectrum. So I think we don't need to introduce this infection. It has become ubiquitous in almost every oculoplasty clinic, with very high and increasing mortality rates, upwards of 50%, even when the brain is not involved. And post the pandemic, even pre-pandemic, 70% of the global burden of mucormycosis was from India alone. And post the pandemic, we've seen excess of 12,000 cases. So this is data from a teaching hospital, which is the Regional Institute of Ophthalmology, Banaras Hindu University. Their first case of post-COVID mucormycosis was seen on 30th April. To date, they have 176 patients who have been admitted, and of which total number of patients discharged were 12, and there have been 42 deaths. In terms of mucormycosis, the split is overwhelmingly majority of cases of 170 out of 176 were of the orbit, with 5 cases of respiratory mucormycosis and 1 of GI mucormycosis. The demographic profile showed that most of the patients were above the age of 40, and the mean age being 52, the range being 30 to 85 years. The heartening thing is that no children were reported, which is good. A majority of the patients were male, and most of them were from the urban setup. Now, this is a large tertiary referral care center that drains almost southern UP and northern Bihar. So a lot of patients were from the urban setup. As you can see, most of them were from the urban districts and the neighboring states. Systemic comorbidities, 196% of the patients were diabetic. A lot of them were, almost 50% were uncontrolled diabetics, and 10% almost were diabetic ketoacidosis. Less than 4%, 4 out of 176 patients were not diabetic at the time of presentation. You can see that the mean HbA1c was in double digits in more than 55% of the patients. This is mean HbA1c at the time of admission, with less than 5% of the patients having non-diabetic HbA1c levels, which means that poor glycemic control was almost universal across the panel at presentation. Other comorbidities included hypertension, renal disease, cardiovascular disease, and cerebrovascular disease, in addition to COPD. But as you can see, hypertension and renal disease were the most common in this. What about the COVID-related parameters? What was their correlation with the severity of COVID with the mucormycosis? 65% of them had a history of being diagnosed with RT-PCR. The others, 16% had antibody positive, which means that they probably had an asymptomatic disease. And 23% were not tested for COVID either through RT-PCR or through antibodies. Of those who were asymptomatic, 30% had home care and 14% were hospitalized. What is the duration between onset of COVID symptoms and the onset of mucormycosis symptoms? Reliable data was available for 108 out of 176 patients. And in most cases, it was more than 2 weeks, which is what most of the data that is now coming corroborates with. Very few patients, 5 patients had almost coexistent disease with less than 5 days between their COVID symptoms and mucormycosis symptoms. Of vaccination status, only 1 patient was vaccinated for both vaccinations, both doses. 80% of the patients had no vaccinations taken, and 17% had a single dose taken. In terms of past history of steroid administration, 65% had a history of being given steroids during the course of their COVID treatment, and 35% did not. Inhalational oxygen, again, majority of the patients had no supplemental oxygen given during the course of their COVID. It is interesting to note that a large proportion of patients were not given oxygen, but still received steroid during their care, when steroid is actually indicated only in severe COVID, where supplemental oxygen and non-invasive or even invasive oxygen is indicated. So there is a mismatch and possibly lack of uniformity in the treatment protocol for COVID. Clinical radiological features, most of the patients had orbitofacial swellings, ptosis and proptosis as we would expect. Loss of vision was seen in more than 1/3 of the patients, and the classical sign of black fungus, as it is called now, was seen in less than 10% of the patients. The orbital involvement was seen in 26% of the patients with unilateral involvement and 9% having bilateral involvement. And in terms of the area involved, you can see that the spread was medial, inferior, superior, and apical disease, and 21 cases or 22% having diffuse orbital involvement. Cavernous CNS involvement was seen in 43% of the patients. In terms of treatment, IV amphotericin B was given to the data available was for 58 patients, only amphotericin B. 35 patients received both amphotericin B as well as posaconazole, and 29 patients received only oral posaconazole. PNS debridement with alone was done in 79 cases. PNS debridement with exenteration in 43 cases, including a staggering 6 cases who required bilateral orbital exenteration. Extensive orofacial surgery, including maxillectomy, palatal resection, and neurosurgical intervention was needed in many cases. And as is the case, the course of the disease, revision surgery involving debridement was needed in 58 patients. Overall total outcome as of now we need to understand that mucormycosis disease is, and treatment is a long-term phenomenon. Patients once started on treatment need to be treated for 4 to 6 weeks at the bare minimum. So this is a point prevalence at this point, and this is a cross-sectional outcome that we are seeing. Patients alive with regression were 32, with progression was 36, and with static disease was 25, and they had 29 deaths in their cohort. In terms of ocular outcome, eye salvage was possible in 49 patients, and the eye exenteration, orbital exenteration, was needed in almost half at 43 patients. So what is a pathophysiology? This is something that we're all reading, that how SARS-CoV, the virus itself, causes damage to the pancreas and induces diabetes. The local mucosal damage in the nose reduces the phagocytic effect and the inability of the ciliated epithelium to control the mucormycosis, therefore allowing the mucormycosis to become more invasive at the nose. The invasiveness in the nose and the lack of phagocytic activity because of the diabetes makes these patients extremely vulnerable. The diagnosis is typically clinical, radiological, and lab-based. The symptoms, I'm sure all of us are comfortable with in knowing it. So these are, it begins with eye ache, redness, congestion, blurring of vision, double vision, drooping of the eyelid, protrusion, and loss of vision. Also, this is not a stepwise disease. We may have patients who have loss of vision, but may still have retained some motility and eyelid movement as well. Non-ocular symptoms, because it's primarily a sinonasal disease, it begins with nasal blockage, headache, which reflects the sinus involvement, nose pain in the nose, the side of the cheeks, blackish blackish discharge, and blackish skull discoloration, as you can see in the photograph below. Difficulty in chewing and loss of sensation, paresthesia, hypoesthesias around the cheek as well. Ocular signs atypically can include sixth nerve palsy, isolated sixth nerve palsy, proptosis, diminution of vision as well. So investigations that you typically do are the COVID test, your glycemic status, inflammatory markers, imaging with MRI with contrast is the standard. However, if in many cases, patients are not suitable for MRI, if they still test for COVID, positive for COVID at the time of diagnosis, so in those cases, CT can be done. A diagnostic nasal endoscopy with a biopsy at that time is important. A swab alone is not sufficient, and deep biopsy is essential. Relevant other specialty consultations and a consent for surgery. Radiological diagnosis, typically you see opacification of the sinuses and fluid level. Bony destruction can be appreciated on CT scan. On MRI, you have the typical black turbinate sign where the necrotic part appears contiguous with the non-enhancing foci. Diffuse orbital involvement in extraocular muscles as well as the intracorneal space shows loss of contrast enhancement, which shows that the orbit is involved. Globe tenting, where the posterior globe angle is increased, is another sign of increased intracorneal pressure and intraorbital pressure. Diagnosis, I think we'll have other speakers speaking on the microbiological diagnosis, which is typically through KOH and calcofluor stain. So how do you stage disease? This is one proposed staging by Dr. Maurya, where he's described it into mild and limited orbital disease and moderate or severe based on clinical signs, which include retropulsion, ocular motility, vision, and orbital imaging, which suggests 1 or 2 quadrant of disease. Moderate or severe disease is firm with frozen globe, vision loss, and extensive radiological involvement and ophthalmoplegia. So management, early surgical debridement with systemic amphotericin B and control of the underlying diabetic or any other immunosuppressive risk factor is the mainstay. Early surgical intervention through paranasal debridement is always associated with improved outcomes. Hospitalization and multisystemic workup is needed. I don't think we need to go through the drugs that are being used. I'll quickly reach the summary. That as we know, blood sugar level control is extremely important. Liposomal amphotericin B is the first line of therapy. Conventional amphotericin B can be used when not available. It is equally efficacious, although it has more drug interactions and toxicity. Posaconazole and isavuconazole are step-down options. Avoid antifungal prophylaxis post-COVID. And exenteration is life-saving and only but we need to know only loss of vision is not an indication for exenteration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akshay Nair, for sharing the data with us. And it's an enormous data. There are so many things that we have learned from it. And we do have such data from different parts of India as well. So I now invite and take the privilege to invite our next speaker, Dr. Parvez Siddiqui, who's a professor of Medical College, Jabalpur from Madhya Pradesh. Over to you, sir.
Can I start my slide share?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, madam. Very kind of you. Is it the slide is visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I first of all thank AIOS for giving me an opportunity to speak upon rhino-orbital cerebral mucormycosis that was prevalent in central India. And we had a very hard time looking into all these problems, because all of a sudden, as the COVID-19 waxed and waned, what happened? There was a sudden spurt in the number of cases of ocular mucormycosis, which had come to us in a horde. This was a PTI presentation on a hospital which was involved in active cure of orbital mucormycosis. This is my alma mater. This is my experience. The study was conducted, as I've already told you, in Government Medical College, Jabalpur. All the departments ranging from ophthalmology, ENT, neurosurgery, pathology coordinated to see that could be able to save the life of the patient. With this particular malady has a incidence quoted in the literature somewhat of 80%, somewhere 70%. So we tried very hard and incorporated all the departments of our college, ranging from ENT, neurosurgery, and pathology also. There is very one question which was pertinent to all these patients. Either they got the knowledge from various sources like print media, or they were referred to ophthalmology department from other departments to our department. These were the questions post-COVID which we have to answer. Why a large number of patients are succumbing to COVID? Venous occlusion cases were coming as more and more D-dimer level were elevated during this post-COVID stage. More of the patient venous occlusion had a elevated D-dimer level, at least twice the normal level. And was the mucormycosis only opportunistic infection in post-COVID sequelae, which we have to deal with? And what this COVID had our say in our own department of ophthalmic fellows and residents. Apart from this, there was a group of patients I've already told you who have read a lot from the Google and various other platforms. And they were anxious enough to know whether they had developed ROCM after COVID infection, or does they have a mild nasal problem and all those. Routine ophthalmological examination ranging to whatever is we are doing for a patient visiting our OPD. These were the observations. Mean age group range from 80 to 17 years. We had a lot of patients of COVID admitted in our own hospital, and there was not only few children were implicated. Male-female ratio was not that much significant. But one thing which was very common was that 85% of these patients had type 2 diabetes mellitus. Either the diabetes mellitus on account of steroid like methylprednisolone or dexamethasone given as a part and parcel of the treatment, or they had a pre-existing diabetes mellitus. Among these, 30%, around 1/3 or 30% of the patients were unaware they had full-fledged sign of rhino-orbital cerebral mucormycosis. And when the reports were sent for pathological examination, they turned up with a temporary or a steroid-induced diabetes mellitus. Mean postprandial blood sugar, at least what I have quoted is 280, but in our ward, I found that they were a little bit more than 300 mg/% in all of the patients, not more in all of the patients. And ketoacidosis was a very frequent feature in these patients. Ketone bodies were prevalent in these patients. we concluded that those patients who had developed ROCM had diabetes mellitus and ketoacidosis as one of the major implicating factors. Whether it was a primary diabetes mellitus or a steroid-induced diabetes mellitus, but increased blood sugar percentage, at least of 300 to 280, was prevalent in each and every patient. And 1/3 of these patients were literally unaware of their diabetic status. They had been given intravenous methylprednisolone or dexamethasone in our hospital or in private hospital of outside our medical college, or they had been given oral prednisolone in high doses like methylprednisolone 16 milligram TDS for 5 days, then tapering it out to 16 milligram BD. That was one of the unique features which we have come to know. Or the chunk of these patients had a very prolonged stay in ICU wards of our college and elsewhere. And they had been administered dexamethasone or methylprednisolone in anticipation to increase the low SpO2, which had fallen down very dramatically from 94 to 84 in a lot of these patients when we looked into the history. And supplemental oxygen support was provided with various means and measures like BiPAP, non-breathable mask, ventilator support. These group of patients always have a supplemental oxygen. And when you looked into their profile, when you looked into the CRP values from the records of our hospital, we came to know there was at least 5 times increase in CRP values from the baseline. On account of severe cytokine storm, and interventionists have to intervene to see that the cytokine storm drops down. CRP values in most of these patients were in the range of 80, 90. That was very remarkable as compared to COVID-1 wave. And we have these were some patients have also been quoted in literature about dextrioxamine. We didn't use much of that. High level of zinc, they have said, might be patient may be forcibly using it. High level of zinc, self-induced zinc toxicity could be there. It has been corroborated as one of the important factors. But as far as dextrioxamine and concern and chelating agent or the zinc uses were there, they might have used, but we didn't. In medical college, we are very much sure we didn't use all the chelating agents and high dose. These were the symptoms which we came to us. The patient came to us with nasal clustering. 100% of these patients had nasal clustering. 100% of these patients had unilateral facial swelling. They had a few patients had unilateral retrobulbar pain, but pain was very severe in 75% of these patients reported to us, and they were not even able to sleep. In 40% of these patients, what I found out, they came to us without being referred to any other on complaint of loss of vision. They had developed a CRO. That was very prevalent on examination with indirect ophthalmoscopy and all those. We found that these 40% of the patients did have no PL perception of light unilaterally. Other ocular symptoms which were very common was unilateral drooping of lids, a restriction of ocular movement, ophthalmoplegia was, diplopia was there, redness and severe pain in the eyes was there. And one patient I came to very strange, he had developed a CSR, recorded in SDOCT of Harmach College department. And they were referred from ENT and dental department. The ENT people, when they referred us, the patient which we had unilateral blockage of nose, epistaxis was very common, though it is not associated, but epistaxis was there. Apart from foul smelling discharge, epistaxis was there. And Escher formation was there around the nasolabial region, which compelled the ENT people to have an ophthalmological checkup. Dental people have also, we have also incorporated the dental department. Most of the complaint which dental OPD, dental surgeon which told us was toothache, loosening of the tooth, increased mobility of the tooth. Palatal eschar was present. Gingival swelling was there, he was telling. There was numbness and tingling sensation over the palatine region, around 30%. And those patients which were referred to neurosurgical wards, where they had developed hemiparesis, seizures, and headache was one of the most important impregnating factors. This is a photograph of the dedicated mucormycosis ward of our college. You can see there were hordes of patients who had been admitted for mucormycosis in our college. All the department consultants were posted over there. These are the few of the signs which I have enumerated. This was the nasal debridement which has been done. These are the few of the signs which I have told you for the same patient, which were there in the medical college, which we had come to know. These were the examination of ROCM patient in dental OPD. You can see a lot of palatal scar and gingival swelling. Loosening of the tooth was one of the complaints for which they visited the dental OPD. Among them, one patient was also a developed CSR, which I've already told you. This is the picture, SDOCT picture of the CSR patient. Visual acuity, those patients who were referred from other OPD like dental and neurosurgical had a vision, in 60% of the vision had a good vision of 660 to 660, and 40% of the patient had no PL at all. We subjected the patient to routine laboratory investigation in our college, ranging from CBC to PTINR, CT scan, and these are the images that we have done. The mainstay of the treatment, basically, which we presumed was we should go for a very aggressive nasal surgical debridement of infected tissue at the earliest possible juncture. Immediately, if the patient, we came out, the patient had a superior orbital fissure syndrome, or he has lost his vision, or due to CR and other causes, we immediately referred the patient to ENT surgeon. They performed debridement at a very aggressive nature. This was the endoscopic nasal debridement, which was done by the department, and 73% patient were immediately taken off for nasal debridement in ENT department. This was a nasal debridement was done. You can see a blackish scarred necrotic area also, which was sent to histopathological examination. Ophthalmological problem were dealt accordingly. Patients were administered in ENT department liposomal amphotericin B 5 to 10 milligram per kg body weight was used in 5% dextrose for 28 days. Later on, they stepped down for a posaconazole 300 milligram BID for 28 days. Ophthalmological problem were dealt by our consultant as required. We had even gone for intracorneal amphotericin B 3.5 milligram per ml in lot of patients who had developed superior orbital fissure syndrome. These are the facts and files of the patient.
Dr. Siddiqui, only 1 minute. To interrupt. If you can quickly wrap it up, please. Yes, thank you so much.
Madam, I've gone for discussion. Really very kind of you. Worst thing was that the patient had an impaired host defenses. They had violin-induced lymphopenia. Corticosteroid was extensively used. And the disruption of blood sugar control was late. DKA events were there. Few of them have been liberated with chemotherapy, organ with much we didn't find out. Thank you, madam, for your patient hearing. This is a nutshell which I have been able to tell us about the various COVID patients which were present in our medical college.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddiqui, and congratulations on this excellent work. I'm sure it would have been a very challenging situation for you, dealing with so many patients in a government medical college in Madhya Pradesh. And so now we go on to the next speaker of the day, Dr. Sunita N., who is a professor in ophthalmology from St. John's Medical College, Bangalore. She is again going to share her experience, her data in the south part of India. Over to you, Dr. Sunita. You may share your slides.
Thank you, AIOS, and especially thank you, Fairoz, for this opportunity. Okay, so since the previous speakers addressed presentations, I'm not going to spend time on that. What we looked at is at the risk factors for the comparing the COVID patients who had mucormycosis and patients who had COVID in the second wave itself and did not develop mucor. So I'll keep my presentation as brief as possible for want of time. So I said that I will be talking on clinical presentation and risk factors. In the clinical presentation, I just want to highlight just one. All the previous speakers have highlighted all the various ways that mucor patients presented and how they are staged as sinonasal, rhinovital, rhinovitocerebral. We also had patients, and the first speaker also said that it need not go in that progression. That's correct. We had two patients who had only rhinocerebral and had no ophthalmic involvement at all. I just wanted to highlight this particular patient, a 29-year-old male who presented with history of loss of vision in the left eye of 24 hours duration. which was associated with mild left-sided headache and retroviral pain. He was diagnosed to have moderate COVID-19 infection about 15 days prior, and he received oral steroids for 10 days. He did not receive any oxygen, and other routine medications which were used for COVID-19 treatment was given to him. He is not a known diabetic and was detected to have very high sugars at the time of presentation to us. And ocular examination revealed that there was no perception of light in the left eye. There was an afferent pupillary defect, and fundus findings showed ophthalmic artery occlusion. His extraocular muscle movements were normal. There was no ptosis and there was no proptosis. Now, in a 28-year-old male who is not a known diabetic who presents with CRAO, there can be multiple causes, and this was in very early phase of the second wave in Bangalore. So the retina person who saw the patient had many other differential diagnoses in mind. But when we both saw the patients together, I said, why don't we get a CT-PNS first, at least minimum? We'll have to keep mucormycosis in mind because there were increased mucormycosis even in the first wave. And CT showed pansinusitis. We also did a MRI brain and orbit to see the extent of orbital involvement. He underwent sinus debridement, and he's now which showed, and the histopathology and the fungal culture showed rise mucorales and aseptate fungal invasion, angioinvasion, and tissue invasion on histopathology. The patient presently has completed his treatment with 4 grams of liposomal amphotericin B, and we are now considering discharging him with posaconazole cover for 15 days. The other patients are routine patients who presented with total ophthalmoplegia, total ptosis, facial pain. They've undergone either debridement or exenteration. And this one patient did not have history of COVID. When he presented to us like this, we got the COVID test done and he was positive, and he remained in the COVID ward for a long time. And that was a difficulty of managing these patients, because for close follow-up becomes very difficult, because each time you will have to get fully ready to go and see these patients. So by the end of the wave, we actually created a COVID cum muco ward to take care of these patients. And this patient had presented like typical rhinophytocerebral with altered sensorium and severe proptosis. This patient did not do well and he expired. So the summary of signs and symptoms, what I want to highlight here, all the other previous speakers have highlighted all this. What I want to highlight here is, normally the rule that we follow at St. John's, we've been treating mucormycosis for a long, long time. And pallid chemosis was the key factor when patients come to you with total ophthalmoplegia. We always think of mucormycosis. This time, quite a few patients presented with severe pain in the orbit and with the signs of inflammation, almost mimicking acute orbital cellulitis. So that was one change, and we noticed that a lot of patients presented with raised on evaluation, the intraocular pressures were also very high, which we had not noticed in the previous non-COVID mucor patients. That was the only difference. Otherwise, more or less, the presentation followed the same pattern of mucormycosis even in non-COVID patients, which we are used to seeing all these years. So we had, I have complete data only for 60 patients. In the second wave, we've had 75 patients with mucormycosis. So I will only present our data for these 60 patients where the data is complete. 21 had sinonasal disease. Rhinovital disease was seen in 31, rhinophytocerebral in 6, and rhinocerebral in 2. So what are the risk factors for rhinovital or for ROC and mucormycosis? So we all, even the previous speaker said, and we know even when we check on literature, it is a rare disease. It used to be a rare disease till we were hit by this sudden surge in mucormycosis case along with the COVID surge. It is a ubiquitous fungus. So even if all of us had a nasal swab taken, many of us would be harboring these spores. So who does it affect? The interplay of the host pathogen interplay is what decides whether a person develops mucormycosis or not. What is required for infection to occur? First, you need the organisms to be present. The organism should germinate by evade the person's immune system and then multiply, cause angioinvasion, tissue invasion, and then it progresses. So that is what is required for mucormycosis to manifest in an individual. So it doesn't happen in a person who's immunocompetent. Phagocytosis takes care of the spores. If by chance these spores bypass the phagocytic function, then the polymorphonuclear neutrophils take over and they destroy the multiplying the fungal elements. And macrophages play this role. Now, all these gets affected in patients with hyperglycemia, especially when they have diabetic ketoacidosis. As low pH reduces phagocytic effects, acidosis releases iron which is bound to proteins. And this free iron is what helps in the free growth of, luxuriant growth of the organism. And hyperglycemia is another factor which helps in the growth of the organism. So presence of iron overload, neutropenia are all the important changes that are required for the organism to become invasive. So what we know so far is diabetics with and without ketoacidosis, hematological malignancies, immunosuppressive therapy, presence of iron load, as you would see in dexferoxamine therapy, which is not in use anymore, steroid use, prolonged steroid use, so solid organ and bone marrow transplants. This is what we've always known. These are the immunocompromised individuals. When it did occur in immunocompetent patients, even in them, there had to be some sort of predisposing factor, maybe burns, trauma where the spores got implanted into the skin. That usually manifested as a dermatological manifestation. I've had experience with at least 2 patients who are immunocompetent and developed mucormycosis. Both had facial burns and scar tissues. So this is a publication many years ago in 2003, where we published 33 cases of rhinoviral mucormycosis. And in this group of patients, the commonest cause was the immunocompetent state was diabetes with and without ketoacidosis in almost 82% of patients, with two having CKD and chronic liver disease, and 1 patient on long-term steroid use for ITP. So why this epidemic of mucor in COVID patients? So we included 64 age and gender matched controls who were COVID-19 patients who were treated at our institution who did not have mucor. Can I just take you through this next 2 slides, Pyros?
50 seconds with you.
Sorry. Okay. So yeah, they were matched gender and age. To remember that COVID patients without mucor was slightly older, but our age matched the data which came out from in the IGO, the latest IGO publication. And there was a major male predilection. There was no hypertension and CKD was not found to be different in the 2 groups, in the mucor and controls. What we found was the highest RBC was severely elevated in patients with mucormycosis. And another important difference between the 2 groups was mucor occurred even in patients with mild and moderate COVID, while our controls were mainly because we included inpatients had moderate to severe COVID. And despite that, the severe COVIDs did not really develop mucormycosis. We may have to wait for some more data. But what was important was the highest RBC was really very high in COVID patients with mucor compared to COVID controls. And HbA1c was also extremely elevated at any given time.
Yeah,
I think this data got mixed up. I think it's the other way around. The COVID with mucor patients on an average had more than 10 HbA1c. Ferritin also was marginally elevated in the mucor group, and the C-reactive protein was also extremely elevated. So,
so
why do patients
wrap it up quick? Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So we need to look at compare our data with the non-patients who did not develop mucor. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing your experience again from one part of South India. Dr. Parikshit, do you want to take over now?
Yes, I would now request Dr. Sandeep Karmarkar, a very well-known ENT surgeon from Maharashtra, and I think who has been doing mucormycosis cases in 3 figures for the past 2 months, and has been doing surgery at the base of the brain and orbital apex and mucor for the last 20 years. So over to you, Dr. Sandeep Karmarkar.
Good morning, everybody. And first of all, thanks my, am I audible? Thanks, my dear friend.
Yes, you're audible, sir.
And All India Ophthalmological Society for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of you and about my experience about the recent, unparalleled phenomenon of mucormycosis. So as our Honorable Prime Minister told us that we would be divided into pre and post-COVID era, we actually don't know when the post-COVID era is going to come because we are just rattling out waves after waves. But just what has come across is this massive onslaught of post-COVID mucormycosis. And these 3 lines are of the 3 presentations which I made over the last few weeks. This was 11,000 weeks back. Now it's close to 31,000 cases. There has been an 150% increase, and cases are still cropping up now. And Maharashtra has clocked almost 10,000 cases, and Pune is about 1,500. So all of my previous speakers have spoken about this. There's some problem with so the second thing, which is how to diagnose this overwhelming mucormycosis cases, how to suspect these group of patients. What we have to really do is when to intervene, and I think we have to intervene almost in all cases. And what do we do by intervening early is to achieve, what do we want to achieve is to achieve ultimately a cure, a minimal morbidity.
Do you have a slide to share, Doctor?
I'm on shared screen, am I not?
No, we are just seeing you. Yeah. Maybe you want.
No, because I was on the share screen.
Could you please reshare?
Try, because I seem to have lost the Zoom window altogether.
We can see you.
What's wrong? My share window, the share pop-up has just gone.
Doctor, can you look at the bottom of your screen that there is a Zoom icon? Can you tap it?
Yes.
There is a screen share icon.
Did the Zoom window came?
What is the CSC team, Ajay?
Yes, Ajay, I'm the chairman scientific committee team, sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you see,
there is,
because we are able to see you, doctor.
Yes, but then, what is happening is I'm not able to. Maybe somebody can take over and I can restart. I think I'll have to restart my Zoom because I cannot.
I think you just leave and join again, sir.
Yes. I think I'll have to do that because, it's coming to the same. I think I'll have to go all over again. Maybe the next speaker, Rahul, can take over.
So we can connect in chat if you're having a problem. We'll sort that out, and meanwhile.
No, ma'am. No. I just called up Dr. Rahul to say that be ready in another 5 or 7 minutes. So he will take another 5-7 minutes to get ready.
Okay. So let me
just.
I think we can move ahead with the next presentation for the time being.
Dr. Savitri, are you there? ready with the presentation, maybe we can go with that.
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Parikshit.
Well, Professor Savitri Sharma needs no introduction in ophthalmology circles. Ma'am has been a pioneer in ocular microbiology and in infectious keratitis, endophthalmitis, and as somebody that all ophthalmologists finally turn to in case of any micro problem. Well, for mucormycosis also, the LV Prasad Eye Care System, one of the best in the world, has turned to her, and we would like to hear from her experiences about mucormycosis and the eye.
Thank you so much, Parikshit. Thank AIOS, and thank you for having me here. I'll share my screen. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes, we can, ma'am.
Okay. All right. It's a pleasure to talk about mucormycosis, which is new for us too. It has been overwhelming for us. Especially I've been in ocular microbiology for last 30 years or more. And I hadn't seen this kind of things earlier. So it was a very, very new experience. And we were quite happy to see something new, feeling very bad for the patients. Though we all know, and many people have talked before, that India is a huge red circle in the world compared to all other countries, and the cases are going up. Although we did have some cases in first wave, and there's a nice publication from Chandigarh, PGI Chandigarh, comparing pre-COVID and the first wave. And now we are at the second wave, and India is topping the list. And this beautiful publication from IGO, I think all of us are floored by this particular publication, which gives the gold mine of information about this wave, and whole country is affected by this, as it shows. And there are some very puzzling questions like, why is Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal have less cases, whether they're being reported less, or we don't know the reason, though they had quite a good number of COVID-19 cases. Now, what are these fungi? They are everywhere present. Everyone said about that. And they are needed in the nature to decay materials and organic matter in the nature. They are also present in our gut and in the upper respiratory tracts as commensals. And they exist in a very simple way. They are either filamentous or they are yeast. And when they're yeast, we all know about candida, and filamentous are again septate or aseptate. This is important because mucor we are dealing with is aseptate. It is very, very characteristic feature of the mucorales. Now, here is a list of mucorales. They were actually earlier called as zygomycetes because they form a sexual sporulation, which is zygomycete, that's why they are called. And also they have asexual sporulation. And the one we are dealing with now, let's only stick to that is mucorales, have many, many genera. In this list, you have genera like mucor, rhizopus, rhizomucor, etc. So why is it called black fungus? Actually, the microbiologists and especially mycologists, they cringed at the word black fungus when it came, and we were all very puzzled that how come this word is becoming so famous when actually mucor is not a black fungus. It is a misnomer, and the name probably came and people started talking about black fungus because of the lesions which become black because of the blood extravasation, and there is oxidization of the iron there. And somehow this word black fungus, though a misnomer, became viral, and every print media and all sorts of media, it started coming. And then we were even more puzzled when green fungus, there is no word like green fungus or white fungus. We have proper names for the fungi. So anyway, The mucorales, when you look at them in the tissues or in the nasal samples of the patients, of the kind patients we are seeing now, they appear in calcofluor white. You can see very broad. Compared to normal fungi, they are like Aspergillus or Fusarium. They are very broad. They have no septae, almost no septae, or they are called pauciseptate, and they look like ribbon-like. I use the word ribbon-like folds. When we use that word, we know that we are meaning the organisms belonging to mucorales. Whereas in potassium hydroxide, KOH method, which is more commonly used, you can see them as unstained, similarly, or septate filaments. What do we do? By now, we have in 1 month, beginning May 10th to June 16th, we have had in our laboratory 109 samples. And despite having the idea as well as telling the clinicians that nasal swabs are not very good samples for yielding or showing the fungus, still I think that is the easiest to take. And that's why we have had more samples which were nasal, and we had other kinds of samples here. Now, what we advise is nasal swab, of course, you use a swab, but tissue when you take, you can directly put it on. This is a blood agar, chocolate agar, and a Sabra dextrose agar and potato dextrose agar. And in case you want to send for PCR in a sterile tube without any fluid, don't use any fluid because there can be contamination. So for the transport of the sample, if you can inoculate on culture media, it's fine. And if you cannot, then you should at least just put it in a sterile bottle without any fluid and send it to the laboratory. Only when you want to do histopathology, you need to put it in formalin. If you're putting in formalin, microbiology cannot be done because the organism has to remain viable. And these methods I already talked about, KOH mount, calcofluor, gram stain we don't recommend because you can see the filaments are not seen very clearly and they collapse and not a very good stain. So we recommend the earlier two. And here is how the in culture, the fungus, it looks actually white. Initially, it is white and cottony. You can see the whole bottle is full. And very slowly, it turns gray or black in color because it produces spores. And these spores are brown or black, and that is not formed in vivo. In the tissues, there is no sporulation like this. These are all in vitro sporulations, and based on the zygospores and based on the rhizoids here, you can see root-like structures, columella, we decide which kind of a species it is. Here is a black fungi. Real black fungi are called Demathiaceous fungi. They have spores which are black, they have colonies which are black, and they have genus like Carvularia, Alternaria, Bipolaris, and they are not associated with mucormycosis. And here is a case where with this proptosis, actually the patient came without any vision, no PL, and the exenteration was done. And this area around the optic nerve is what was sent to us. And you can see the filaments in GMS stain, calcofluor white, and also the around the vessel there is infiltration. These are the black ones, the fungal filaments, and in pars also you can say perineural infiltration. But here is a case which was, we were very surprised. The surgeon called and said there is an abscess, lid abscess, and there is no other sign, but in the MRI, there was a place where it was seen touching the bones and maybe bony invasion. And then she sent a large amount of pus in a syringe. And I made several smears because she said, please look for mucorale. And here is one short fragment, which is broad aseptate. Then I gave that sample to the pathologist because I was not convinced to see such a short fragment. And then when she looked very carefully, made a cell block, and then we could see the similar mucor-like fungus in the histopathology sections also. There was no growth in culture. So the only proof we had was these histopathology and microbiology pictures. In colony, when the organism grows, it forms cotton. I already showed you in PDA and SDA. Here is a cotton seen very beautifully on blood agar. And in the SDA bottle, it just fills up. And we have many other points in that by which we identify these are different sporangiophores, sporangium, and different parts, and these are the zygospores, and here are the number of species that you can see. What about antibiotic susceptibility? All these group of organisms are usually susceptible to amphotericin B, posaconazole, and isavuconazole. And itraconazole is also mentioned, but clinical efficacy has not been shown. What we do in the laboratory is a microbroth dilution method. So you take different concentrations of the antibiotic and inoculate the organism, and then see up to which dilution there is growth. And the first dilution which shows that there is no growth, that is the visible growth, is MIC. And if you subculture and you find that there is no growth at a slightly higher concentration, and that is called minimum fungicidal concentration. So this is how we determine that. Also, molecular methods I must tell you about, which are being used not only for identification of the fungus, but also for the clinical samples. In our LV Prasad Eye Institute in Bhubaneswar, we are developing that. And this is about sequencing. I will not go into detail, but this is the PCR which has been developed. Fungus and the mucorales, there is a clear difference in the size of the amplicon that forms 250 or 259 or 340. So this is something we have just sent it for publication, and the study is ongoing. I'll skip these risk factor because many people already talked about this in detail earlier. So they are not really relevant now. Now, I have to say is, what do we do? Fungus we cannot get rid of in our country, but the hospital infection control surveillance in the ICUs and hospital areas are very, very important. Patient at home also, there need to be a control of the environment, and there is no other way we can control this. Of course, the risk factors of diabetes, steroids, etc. have to be taken care of. I thank you so much for your kind attention. Shall I unshare?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Savitri, ma'am. Now I would request Dr. Ma'am, if you can just stop screen share.
Unshare icon is not seen. Where is that icon?
Already unshared now.
Already unshared.
Unshared, I think. Yeah, because it's not showing it.
Ma'am, you're already unshared.
Okay, okay. Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I will just, Dr. Rahul Kulkarni is a very well-known neurologist in Pune. He has been a topper throughout his career, and he has many national and international accolades to him. But today we want to hear him about mucormycosis and the neurologist's perspective on mucormycosis. Dr. Rahul, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah, so I will just share the screen and I will start with Dr. Rahul's presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Parikshit, and thank you, the Ophthalmology Society, for inviting me. So I'll be talking about, there will be some repetition because it's a small topic and everyone has probably got more or less similar kind of patients. So I'll show initially what kind of work that we have done and what's a neurologist's take on this disorder of mucormycosis. So Parikshit, can you share the slides?
Yes, I will. Just give me a minute, sir.
Take it.
Can you see it?
No, Dr. Parikshit, you might have to share the screen, please.
Yeah.
You have the presentation on the
Yep.
laptop? Yeah. Please share.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Rahul, please.
Thank you. So I'll talk on what's a neurologist's perspective on this topic. Of course, there will be some repetition, but I'll try and skip as much as possible. Next slide, please. Why this topic? This topic has been there in the meetings of neurologists, not just neurologists, ENT specialists, ophthalmologists, physicians, infectious disorders. Why this topic has come and why suddenly there is so much increase of this fungi in COVID in India? Of course, we know that India was put on high alert because of these 3 points. Number one, India has the second highest number of COVID patients in the world, only next to USA. India is the second most common country where diabetes has been prevalent, next to China, and we know that diabetes has been the risk factor for the mucor and especially the rhino-orbitocerebral find of mucor for many years. And of course, India has the highest burden of mucor in the world. There are 140 cases per million population in India, and the second most common country as far as prevalence is considered is Pakistan, where the number is just 25. So India has far high number of mucor cases in the world compared to other countries. Next slide. So because of these 3 points, there is no doubt, just click once. We are seeing and expected to see a large number of cases of mucor in our country. Next slide. And then why neurologists in this topic? Because we know that the presenting symptoms of this disease is many times neurological. The headache, the facial pain, the double vision, the loss of vision, or maybe the facial palsy, or even the strokes. And neurologists have been managing mucor for decades. We have been managing this for a very long period. Amphotericin, the drug which is commonly used for the treatment, has been used by neurologists for many years. We use it in many of our disorders, including cryptococcal meningitis. And we know how many neurologists know what are the side effects, how to manage the side effect of this drug. And of course, when there is a CNS invasion, it leads to increased mortality, which a neurologist can diagnose easily. Next slide. So this was a recent publication that we did about a month ago, and I am happy that the name of your talk is just the same as what we had written here, Epidemic of Mucormycosis in COVID Pandemic. This was a position paper that we published in our national journal in India. Next slide. And then we tried to analyze whether this is really, the incidence has really increased or what is the status. This is a small study from our own hospital, where of course we had looked at cases till April of 2021. We have not looked in May and June when we had large number of patients. But even if you see for this 2 years, consecutive years between 18 to 20, besides 20 to 21, the incidence has increased more than 5 times about the admissions. So our hospital admission because of mucor have increased by more than 5 times. So the 2 incidence is definitely increasing. We do not have the exact figure of increased incidence, but it seems that the incidence has definitely increased, and it is probably more than 5 times. Next slide. And then we also did a similar study, which is under publication with the help of various neurologists across the state of Maharashtra. And these are the various places from where we had collected cases. Next slide. And just run briefly, because everyone has showed more or less similar kind of thing. The commonest age, of course, was between 50 to 60. Next. It was predominantly male predominance, more than 3/4 were males. Steroid use was there in COVID in about 90% patients. Remdesivir was used for more than 80%. Tocilizumab was used in 13%. And oxygen and ventilator was again 30 to 60% patients. So more or less similar to what has been shown by other speakers as well. Next slide. Diabetes was seen in about 80%. 13% patient developed diabetes after COVID, which is a well-known fact. Non-diabetics were only 6.6%. Hypertension and CKD were in some patients. And the other risk factors like malignancy and immunosuppressions were not seen in our patients. Next. And the onset was with COVID within 2 weeks of the so-called COVID period in about 60% patient, while in 41% patient, it started after COVID. And the mean duration usually was around 14 days and maximum was 2 months. We had one patient where the onset was 60 days after COVID. But most of the COVID mucor has started within, the symptoms of mucor has started within first 2 weeks of COVID onset. Next. And then presenting features, of course, this was a study done by neurologists, was predominantly neurological symptoms were there: headache, facial pain, diplopia, vision loss. There were focal neurological deficit, facial palsy, as well as seizures. So many neurological symptoms were there in our study. Next. The other symptoms which have been described by others were not very common in our study, but of course, this was a study done by neurologists. The patients were seen by neurologists predominantly here. Next slide. And as far as imaging was concerned, nose nasal rhinitis was seen in about 96%, paranasal sinus involvement was 98%, orbital involvement was seen in 72%, cavernous sinus involvement 43%, brain 30%, and strokes were seen in about 7.4%. So about 50% patient had neurological involvement. Next slide. And the important about the next slide, like the madam described just now, nasal scraping was positive in 2/3 of the patient. In about 10% patients, 8.3% patient, when the nasal scraping was negative, histopath picked it up. So even if nasal scraping is negative, don't just think it is not fungal infection. One has to look at other things. And I think the Calcofluor stain has really changed the game. It is a fluorescent stain which can really pick up the fungal elements immediately. So that has really changed compared to KOH. I think Calcofluor has really changed the diagnostic skills of this disorder. Next. And in our study, it was not just mucor. Mucor was seen in 87%. About 4% had aspergillus, and about 7% had both mucor as well as aspergillus. So this is not an uncommon phenomenon to have a dual infection. And in about 10% of our patients, we had more than just mucor, aspergillus, as well as a comorbid double infection. Co-infection was seen in about 7% of patients. So one must have a good microbiology backup to see whether it is not just mucor, but maybe combination of the disorder. Next. And the drugs were used more or less same. This was a study done when isavuconazole was just started using. Of course, we're using it more often nowadays, but this was a study which was done till April end. Next. And outcome-wise, if you have a good team, you can see that 60% patient had improved, 34% was mortality compared to what has been described in the literature about 50 to 80%. Our mortality was just 1/3 of the patient. Only one patient is still under study, and 4.1% patient left and went to some other hospital. So 60% of our patient had improved, which I believe is a decent figure. Next, now, talking about the pathophysiology, there are many hypotheses which have been given. This is a hypothesis that we had proposed, that the invasive mycosis occur as a part of 4-pronged attacks. It is the past illnesses, the commonest of it being diabetes mellitus, but also other disorders can be part of it. But the commonest in patient who had COVID-related mucor was diabetes. Because of COVID, we know that there is immune dysregulation. So immune dysregulation can lead to invasive infection. There is hyperglycemia because of pancreatic involvement in COVID that leads to new onset of hyperglycemia or increased sugar, even in people who are having diabetes because of COVID itself, not just because of steroid, but because of disease. That can be a trigger for it. High ferritin we know is a risk factor because that leads to increased iron accumulation, and the iron and acidosis is a well-known risk factor for mucor. And of course, there may be unknown risk factors which may come up.
I slides आके कर रहा हूँ mucor के लिए.
And as far as COVID, just 1 minute, go back.
मैं आपको 10 मिनट में call back.
And about COVID treatment, we know that steroids are the risk factor. Tocilizumab also is a known risk factor. We don't know whether oxygen, invasive ventilation are risk factor. They have been proposed by many because we know that the predominant fungal infection are occurring either in lungs, that is pulmonary aspergillosis, or the rhino-orbidocerebral mucormycosis. So they are predominantly involving in the area which is along the airways. So we don't know whether oxygen, the tubings have some role into this. And the other risk factors like environmental risk factor, whether the mucor is acquired through the healthcare system, whether there is an issue with the host immunity, or whether the virus itself has triggered a change in the fungus and that has caused this, we don't know. So it is this 4-pronged attack that probably is the cause of this unique disease which has suddenly jumped in entry of India. Next slide. So these were our collaborators with whom we did this study in Maharashtra. Next. Now talking about challenges, I think we'll skip this. Next slide. So there are many unanswered questions about this and what are the ways forward? What are the risk factors? Whether the dose of steroid matter, whether any steroid is worse than the other steroid, whether remdesivir is a risk factor, we don't know. Whether the severity of COVID or hospital stay, duration of hospital stay are the risk factors, suggesting that mucor could have been acquired in hospital. Oxygen, tubings, ventilation, whether they are risk factor, whether this mucor is different from the routine mucor, whether the treatment is similar or different, because we know that many of the doctors are using only non-amphotericin drug and patients are getting better. What are the poor prognostic indicator? Of course, whether we can prevent it. These are the questions which need to be answered. Next. And I am happy that the Ophthalmology Society has come up with a really large and good paper, and it would have answered some of these questions. But we need more studies. Of course, we need to improve the awareness about the disease. We need more data and registries. We need case control studies, and we are indeed doing one of these kind of study. We need some basic science research. More experts are needed for this disease. Next slide. So if you look at the fungi, the smallest fungi would produce more diffuse disorders like meningoencephalitis. Little larger fungi like Candida would produce granulomas or microabscesses, which are little localized kind of disorders. Next. If you have very large fungi like Aspergillus and they would really produce strokes or this rhino-orbidocerebral syndrome. Just one slide next. And the intracranial complication of this disease is because of contagious spread. It can lead to cavernous sinus thrombosis. It can produce abscesses. It can produce meningitis, and it can also produce cerebrovascular disorders because of involvement of the vessels, including strokes and aneurysms. Next. So these were two of our patients. One had stroke, one has interstitial hemorrhage. Next. The next one has involvement of the cavernous sinus with a small infarct. The second patient, of course, has orbit, and it is going in the intercranial cavity. Next. So to conclude, fungal infections become common in post-COVID scenario. Everyone must know, not just ENT ophthalmologists and neurologists, but also physicians and all other surgeons also. Early diagnosis, early surgery, early treatment is important. It is just the teamwork for everyone. One should not neglect these symptoms with which patients are many times sent home by GPs: headache, facial pain, numbness, diminished vision. One must look at these patients. We need more studies, of course, to answer some of these questions. And neurologists are integral part and many times captain of management of the disease, especially if there is intracranial involvement. Next. It is a disease which has started in India, unique disease in India. It's a new epidemic, and the answers must come from India. We all must work together to find out answer for this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul, for the wonderful presentation. Any questions for him?
Dr. Parikshit, do we have Dr. Sandeep here? I can't find him in the login.
Dr. Sandeep, I think he's still very much here.
Okay.
Can we start your presentation, sir?
Sure. I'll just share screen.
We'll have the discussion during the panel discussion.
I hope I am audible and visible both.
Yes.
Yes, and so is your screen, sir.
Perfectly, thank you. So, sorry for that little technical glitch, and I really don't know why this has happened, but let us just start off quickly. So I'm just going to rush through these few slides which I've already spoken about, but to just cut it short, as Dr. Rahul and Dr. Sharma and the previous speakers said, this is a multidisciplinary approach, and we need to involve all the possible specialists to achieve a good outcome. So my topic of presentation here today is the role of an endoscopic sinus surgery and how life-saving it is in the current scenario of rhinoorbital mucormycosis. I'll talk about certain situations, but a few important things which I need to mention is it all starts most likely in the nose. And therefore, we need to be very, very vigilant as ENT surgeons to try and pick it up early and try to give a good cure. The whole treatment protocol, apart from the medical, the prevention, is the concept of end arteritis obliterans, the angio invasion of the fungus. So whatever surgery we are going to do has to be done in such a manner that we have to try and eliminate all the devitalized tissues. Surgery is to remove the necrotic tissues so that the medical therapy will reach and allow drug penetration. So remember, apart from just trying to save life, we have to do a good surgery so that we will allow the medicines to act optimally in order to achieve a good result. The various staging systems have been proposed, and this is by one of our seniors, Dr. Honavar. It's already there in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. But from the matters of convenience for ENT surgeons or for people to understand, I put them always in these three zones of clinical progression. The first is zone 1, where we are just infected the nasal mucosa and sinuses. The zone 2, as per Dr. Honavar, the stage 3 is the orbital involvement, the orbital apex superior orbital facial syndrome. And the zone 3 is where the maximum mortality occurs, is the cerebral involvement due to intracranial spread due to the various pathways. And as an ENT surgeon, there are two important pathways for us to try and prevent it, is the superior orbital fissures, the pterygopalatine fossa, and the cribriform plate. So these are the zone-wise symptoms. They are very much the same, and I really don't want to elaborate on this. These are the typical zones of progression. Zone 1, where there is no ophthalmic symptom, purely nasal and paranasal sinuses, just involvement of the eye, and this is very bad with a temporal lobe abscess. I cannot hesitate to put this picture of diagnostic nasal endoscopy because for me, there are only two specific investigations. A good diagnostic nasal endoscopy, which shows the S-sharp and that almost always clinches the diagnosis. And the second, of course, ma'am has told about the lab diagnosis, the histopathology. But as a surgeon, we need to have an imaging, and the gold standard for imaging is an MRI with a gadolinium contrast. And I preferably like to do this MRI a day prior to surgery because we've seen that there's so much of panic amongst patients that sometimes the MRI when done very, very early might just overplay the disease. So a good MRI 1 day prior will give us the exact idea about which are the tissues. And typically, as you see here in this film, this is the image, the T2, where there is complete involvement of the maxillary sinus, and this is the post-contrast where there is no enhancement. And this is the one which it is important to show, as Dr. Savitri ma'am had told, there was a case of abscess which was picked up on MRI. So a good MRI is going to be the key. The management, of course, is all interrelated and is futile without each other. A good surgery may be futile without adequate therapy. And this was the challenge which we have been facing. Dr. Parikshit has been seeing all my patients, and we know we have to literally struggle for amphotericin B availability time and again. So a good surgery and a bad medical therapy because of unavailability and vice versa is going to make things difficult for the patient. So we have more than 100 cases now. This was the list till about 31st May. We've operated about 77. And as you know, we have had about 4 cases of mixed fingers, as my colleague and friend Rahul had already told us about this. The minimum HbA1c was 6.6, the max was 13, but the average was 9.8. So there are lots of things which are really the catalyst for all these things. But as a surgeon, now I'm just going to pause this and I'm just going to tell you, this is a picture which I've put up so that for orientation, all my videos are going to be left-sided. This is the left nasal cavity. This is the left nasal cavity. Here is the lateral side. This is the lateral nasal wall, and the orbital side. This is the nasal septum. So this is how typically on an endoscopy in the early zone 1 case, you will see that, there is no frank blackening, but then there is, necrosis. There's a little bit of blackish eschar here. And a good endoscopy, this is of course an intraoperative picture with a thorough cleaning that we do for all cases. And then you can see the middle turbinate here on the left-hand side, very, very early necrose. So all these areas have to be devitalized, debrided with the help of the microdebriders. And as you can see, the lateral nasal wall is being removed. We have sophisticated instruments. All the ENT surgeons have them now. And you can see how the underlying bone is. So removing of all the devitalized area, necrotic area, going right up till the septum in the midline, to the lateral nasal wall, to the paranasal sinuses. And you can see the periorbiter here. It's very healthy. So in a normal, typical zone 1 case where there is only involvement of the paranasal sinuses and the nasal cavity, a good exteriorization or removal of all the necrotic tissue up till this stage is what is necessary. The next case is a left-sided with a little more advanced disease. And you can see here, and you'll soon see how there's complete blackening of the tissues. Now, these are the cases where you have to be much more thorough in your debridement. And at times you have to even go up till the cribriform fossa dura, remove everything. Not, of course, trying to create a CSF leak, because connecting an infected cavity to a non-infective zone or sterile zone like meninges will just create disaster. So again, a left-sided debridement is going on. And you can just see here. Now look at the periorbita in this case. This is completely unhealthy. But the patient has absolutely normal eye. This is the anterior ethmoidal artery. This is the septum. This is the cribriform plate dura. Look at the periorbita. Now, so these are the cases where we would definitely involve our colleague, Dr. Parikshit, and ask him to give, intraconal or retrovertebral amphotericin B. And sometimes we even give it through the medial orbital wall. The compartment syndrome is taken care of because there is no medial orbital wall anymore. This is one of the cases who had presented with us. This was about 3 months back. The eyes, he has no vision, but the eye is completely normal. And this was the follow-up just about 15 days back. So by doing a good debridement, we can definitely save the eye as well as the life. Another case, you can see the vision was normal, but the eye was completely involved. And this again is the left side septum, maxillary sinus has been opened well. And here you would see that her periorbita is completely necrotic. We've just taken a little incision on the medial periorbita. We are incising it, and you can see the necrotic slough coming out. So a further debridement remaining between the muscles not to injure the other vitalized parts of the group. So orbital debridement will definitely help here and help not only to save the eye as well as the life. The zone 3 is where the maximum mortality is affected, where we have the superior orbital fissure involvement, orbital apex, pterygopalatine fossa. And in such cases, you know, like this was one of the cases who was very bad. You can look at the eye here. This is just for orientation, the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure. And we are going in through.
Sorry, sir, for interrupting, but can we please sum it up in next?
Sure. So this is just one of the cases, and you can see that we have done a thorough intracorneal debridement. The optic nerve is exposed, and nowadays, why I wanted to show you this is we put amphotericin B gel inside the globe to take care of the disease. So we are just going to take over. Just going to go fast. This is one case with a temporal lobe abscess, and you can see the neurosurgeon doing the craniotomy. So the complications still occur in spite of good surgeries, but early detection and treatment is generally the key. A high index of suspicion and identify potential patients. We don't know what is in store for us next, but we still have to be careful. So thank you, All India Ophthalmology Society, for allowing me to do this talk on an epidemic amidst a pandemic. Prevention is the key. Thank you once again. And sorry for the technical glitch initially.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandeep.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep.
Mute the other. Ajay? Yeah, all right. So may I request Dr. Usha Kim, who is the chairperson of this session, to take over the panel discussion. And we have eminent panelist over here who has done excellent work for the past many months on mucormycosis with us, involving the Oculoplasty Society of India. Over to you, Dr. Usha Kim.
Thank you, Fairoz. I think it was an excellent session because we've learned a lot of things from various specialists.
Past many years, Doctor.
Sorry?
Ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah. So it was a very nice session, as I mentioned. And we've had various seasons of mucor. I think it was an earlier session in the northern states, and it's picking up in the southern states now. We've all crossed double digits, and we're all moving towards 3 digits now. I think all of us have a significant number of cases representing different parts of the southern states as well. So the only thing we need to concentrate on now is, for me, my own personal question to the people who have handled it in the earlier season was, what were the cases which we actually went in for exenteration? Maybe I could ask the question to either an ENT person or an ophthalmologist who's been dealing with, since Dr. Maurya is not here, could I request somebody from the ENT colleagues who had actually worked with the ophthalmologist, which kind of cases actually went in for exenteration? I think that's a very important question for us to know.
Ma'am, we have Dr. Grover and Dr. Hunavar, all those.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, probably one of them can, it'll be useful for everybody. Dr. Grover, sir, or Dr. Santosh, either of you can take this question, please.
Sure. I feel that hyperglycemia is the one constant factor that has been shown. And that is the reason I feel that we will be able to preserve many more cases from going in for exenteration or for mortality. Because the rapid control of hyperglycemia on admission can protect all those who have not yet reached a very severe stage. And greater awareness has meant that in the latter part of the epidemic, we were getting many more with just rhinological involvement and not yet with ophthalmic involvement. Second thing that I would stress is, besides, of course, an early debridement, early treatment, which plays a huge role, nasal debridement particularly, and early amphotericin B. The third important thing that we have in our armamentarium, which has now been proven to be useful, is the use of orbital amphotericin B. And that can be a major tool in preserving vision as well as in preventing exenterations. Mortalities, as the neurologist showed, has been markedly reduced even in neurologically involved cases. In our series also, it was only 25 so far out of the 131 documented one. We now have over 180. So I think we must realize that because it is predominantly hyperglycemia, which can be controlled, and we have retrobulbar amphotericin B in our armamentarium, it is possible to have much fewer deaths and many fewer losses of vision.
Dr. Santosh, what would be your indication for exenteration?
Well, diffuse orbital disease, which is progressive despite a good sinus debridement, and on amphotericin full dose for 72 hours. Worsening within 72 hours despite full dose and debridement is an indication. Second is diffuse orbital disease at the time of presentation itself. Along with sinus debridement, you can combine if the eye is PL negative. And intracranial extension currently is not a contraindication for exenteration. In fact, in the large series that we recently published, we have shown that even in a patient who has extensive CNS involvement, orbital exenteration can be life-saving versus those who did not undergo orbital exenteration. So at any stage we can do it, but the earliest we do is when there is diffuse orbital involvement. Otherwise, as Dr. Grover said, we try to control it with retrobulbar amphotericin, which is very useful.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, the other most important question is, I think we have another 5 minutes only, so we'll cover this most important aspect, that is the amphotericin B administration. Especially, we won't call it retrobulbar, we will call it intraorbital.
Correct.
And when should we give it and when should we stop it? Could I request one of the Dr. Grover sir or Dr. Santosh, because I think I don't see other ophthalmologists in the...
Ma'am, we have Dr. Ramesh Murthy here, Mukesh Sharma.
Yeah, Mukesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, could Mukesh take that question? Dr. Mukesh, please.
Yes, ma'am. Actually, there are different versions, and I don't think there is a consensus in the frequency of intraorbital amphotericin B also, that how frequent it should be given. Now, my take is on alternate day. Whatever we have given, we are doing it alternate day, but there are people who are giving it on the daily basis also. So I think the end point is that whenever disease starts showing signs of regression, that's the end point of it. And obviously, if it is progressing, then one may think of giving it daily also. But I tend to...
Anybody have the maximum number of injections? Anybody?
No, there is no maximum number yet, but we limit to 7 and then repeat a scan and then see what is the residual disease. You can restart it. Actually, it does not cause any damage to the orbital tissues. That is what is known. Even patients who have received 12, 14 injections are not having any abnormal signs. It's not causing orbital fibrosis. We have 3-4 months follow-up now. Patients have near total recovery of ocular motility. So nothing is a concern with amphotericin B. I feel it is safe.
So is there a difference between liposomal amphotericin B and deoxycholate?
Absolutely not. Earlier described protocol is 3.5 milligram of deoxycholate. Now, if you use liposomal,
not the dose, but the reaction.
Correct. No, absolutely no difference, except that deoxycholate can produce orbital compartment syndrome because it is heavy molecular weight and it absorbs water from the surrounding areas. But if the FES is already done, obviously compartment syndrome is protected.
One reason why we may prefer deoxycholate is that you need to just give 1 ml probably.
Correct.
And you'll need to give much higher volume with the because of the concentration being available of liposomal. So we've been using deoxycholate for that reason. And I think I agree with Santosh that they do well within 7 injections. There are only a couple of them where we've exceeded 7 injections of the 41 that we've documented in our first 131.
Limited debulking is also a possibility. If there is, say, medial orbital disease, you can always do a medial transconjunctival approach and debulk that abnormal tissue, and under visualization, you can give injection. And liposomal, we use just 1 ml, which is 1 milligram, not 3.5. So we don't increase the volume when there is liposomal.
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but we need to wind up this session.
Yeah. So one last point is we can give injections, and we need not give any anesthesia for that. So that can reduce the compartmental syndrome. And the last point I'd like to say is, yes, we like to use lyophilized because of the cost factor too. That's one additional point. Thank you very much, all of you. I think it was an excellent session.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Very educative.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor. Thanks from Scientific Committee team.
We couldn't take many questions because of the time constraints from the other panelists, but I, thank all the panelists being here and, being part of this particular session. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Fairuz.
Thank you, Fairuz. Very well organized.